Hello, and welcome to Two Pews in a Pod. Join us as we explore faith in a modern world at Evangelical Lutheran Church in Frederick, Maryland. Now, here is your host, Pastor Paul Baglios.
I'm Paul Baglios, and happy once again to welcome those of you who are listening or watching to another episode and another series of the podcast, Two Pews in a Pod, here at Evangelical Lutheran Church. We're going to do something different for this particular three-part series. I am joined by the other Pastor Baglios, my spouse Sharon, and our deacon Megan Wyant. The three of us are going to be talking about people of our Christian past who have had a particular influence on us personally. And we're calling this series Luminaries of Our Christian Past because I like fancy words I don't get to use very often. Each of us have chosen a particular figure that we're eager to talk about, and we're going to do that in chronological order. I'm going to be talking about Henry Melchior Muhlenberg. And then in the next episode of this three-part series, Deacon Wyant will be talking about Sojourner Truth. And in the final episode of this series, Sharon will be talking about Dorothy Day. But we're going to start with Henry Melchior Muhlenberg. Those of you who are members of Evangelical Lutheran Church or friends of the congregation, perhaps visitors to the congregation, may be very aware that the large historical plaque mounted to the front of our church building, fronting on Church Street, has the name of Henry Melchior Muhlenberg etched large. Who was he? He was a person who had come to the colonial, pre-United States, to British colonial America. He arrived in the year 1742. He had been born in 1711, and as he grew into young adulthood, he had aspired to prepare for the ordained ministry as a pastor, and he wanted very much to be a missionary. After his ordination in Germany, he was hoping that he would be commissioned and sent to serve as a missionary in India. And he was waiting for that opportunity, but other plans were afoot that he knew nothing about. He was associated with the Franke Institutes in Halle, Germany. They helped to organize, promote, and support all kinds of missionary enterprises, both in Germany and other parts of the world. They provided a hospital, they provided a school in Halle, and they commissioned pastors to go serve as missionaries in, as I said, other parts of the world. Muhlenberg was hoping to go to India, but it was not to be. The leaders of the Halle Institutes had been receiving communications for several years from three very early organized Lutheran congregational communities in and near the city of Philadelphia in colonial Pennsylvania. They had been pleading for a pastor to be sent to them. And finally, in response to their pleas, the leaders of that missionary enterprise in Halle asked young Pastor Muhlenberg, would he be willing to answer their pleas for a pastor? Would he be willing to come to Pennsylvania in British colonial America rather than going to India? They assured him this would be a 3-year term assignment, that he would serve for 3 years and then return to his homeland of Germany and continue to serve there while awaiting another assignment. What he didn't know when he boarded the ship to make the transatlantic crossing in 1742 is that he would never see his homeland again. As he bid farewell to his family and friends, former colleagues and parishioners in Europe, He was, in fact, bidding farewell forever. He began to put down deep roots in the soil of British North America and to build a life and to build a church, a denominational life, in fact, beyond what he had anticipated at the outset. He served in North America from his arrival in 1742 until his death in 1787. 3 years after he arrived, he married a young woman who was the daughter of a very influential and very supportive person of influence in the Pennsylvania field named Conrad Weiser. Young Pastor Henry was introduced to, courted, and wed Anna Maria Weiser. And they became the parents of a large family, including 3 sons, all of whom assumed positions of stature in early American history. Their eldest was a general in Washington's army and then became a senator. Their middle son became the first Speaker of the House under the Constitution, and their youngest son had become a internationally renowned botanist who was influential in the development of scientific disciplines in the early United States. But Henry Melchior Muhlenberg became, in his own right, renowned for a tremendous capacity to bring order and organization and stability to the scattered and often bereft of leadership Lutheran faith communities that were congregating not only in southeastern Pennsylvania, but other parts of the pre-United States where German-speaking migrant peoples were settling. Eventually, his reputation for being able, through the careful crafting of good congregational constitutions, and how that brought order and stability to congregations, he was called upon to serve the cause of churchly order and stability far afield of the Philadelphia area, northward to New York, eastward to New Jersey, and then following the Great Valley Road that German migration was taking into Maryland, Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia. It was in that capacity that he helped this congregation, Evangelical Lutheran Church, founded in 1738, so founded 4 years before Muhlenberg had ever arrived in North America. But when Evangelical Lutheran Church had begun to get some momentum, to get some legs under itself, he was influential in helping them to adopt a constitution that would ensure a stable future on which they could build.
That's pretty incredible. I didn't know that. I didn't know that connection with ELC, so I like knowing that. That's very cool. I do wonder, so how did you, is it the Pennsylvania roots that made you interested in bringing him up today?
So I had first become interested in him because I was a graduate of Muhlenberg College in Allentown, Pennsylvania. Okay. And despite that, I really had no idea who the college was named for or what the name meant. When I later was a student in seminary, I began to learn about Henry Melchior Muhlenberg as a prominent mission developer, we would say, in colonial North America, and became curious. Muhlenberg College in Allentown, Pennsylvania is not named specifically for Henry Melchior Muhlenberg or for any of the Muhlenbergs, but for the family as a whole. But I became interested to learn more about his life and his work. And as I started to study, I became absolutely enthralled with the character and scope of his life.
Well, I think it's particularly interesting to like that leaving home and coming here And then the idea of that it became like church administration too, because I'm sure in a young pastor, that's not necessarily what you're thinking about when you're going, okay, I'm going to go, it's going to be different. I'm not going to India. I'm going to Pennsylvania in the colonies. And I'm going to be helping set up this church. And then you end up helping create constitutions and bylaws for more of an administrative level. It's not necessarily what I think he probably would have thought of doing.
Well, and he was a very tireless preacher and giver of pastoral care. And he had been schooled in a Lutheran churchly culture where pastors were often also the dispensers of medicines and medical care. His journals are replete with noting that he was called to visit so-and-so who was ill, and he will note so often, so I bled her.
I did not know this, that was a part of the pastoral role too.
Yes.
Like I knew there were barbers and things that did those kind of surgical things and really shouldn't be doing it either.
Well, and the Franca Institutes in Halle would provide their missionaries shipments of medicines.
Okay.
So a pastor was also a sort of amateur physician and an apothecary. And while the writing of church constitutions may sound dull and boring, the reason it was so important is because it helped to build a protective wall around congregations from the predations of rogue pastors, of which there were many. In colonial circumstances, a lot that happened outside any regulation or legal enforcement, and anyone who wanted to, whether they were a pastor or not, could purport to be a pastor. If they were German speaking, they could simply claim that they had been ordained in Germany. They could move about these German communities, and always for a fee, they could say, I can do your baptisms, I can do your weddings, I can do your funerals.
I can do your bleedings.
I can do your bleedings.
Do you need a tooth pulled?
So how has your love for Muhlenberg and your study of Muhlenberg impacted your own ministry?
So as I say, and I have to comment on his journals. So it was expected that the missionaries who were sent from Halle would be regularly returning reports of what they were up to, because those reports helped to generate funding and subsidy for the missionary enterprise. And Muhlenberg became a lifelong dedicated keeper of journals and records from which these reports would come. They have been all transcribed and translated into English, published some decades ago in 3 large English language volumes. I've read the whole 3-volume set cover to cover at least 4 times.
Wow.
And even had the opportunity once while doing research for my dissertation to be in the archive holding in Philadelphia, where the actual journals that he kept, into which he wrote, are still preserved. And I was permitted not only to view them, but to hold them. And that sense that my hands were on these artifacts that his hands had held was just, for me then, and even to describe it, it was moving. But what impacted me was, again, he was tireless as a preacher and a provider of pastoral care. Unlike the manner in which we serve, we are sitting here recording this episode in my office, the pastor's office of the Hahn Building on the campus of Evangelical Lutheran Church. Muhlenberg never had an office. The congregations that became strong enough to build churches built church buildings, but there were no other sorts of facilities. They were spaces in which worship services could be held. He could keep a study in his own modest home, but all of his work would have begun every day by saddling and mounting a horse to ride to the places where he was going to visit the sick or comfort the dying, where he was going to instruct the young, where he was going to preach, where he was going to celebrate the Lord's Supper with a gathering of people. And these were never, for him, short commutes. He made his home in Trapp, Pennsylvania, where one of the congregations that he served was located. But he spent 45 years of his life very much as an itinerant pastor, covering an ever-expanding geography of pastoral influence and responsibility, and would often comment in his journals on his weariness, comment on the perils that he faced when, for example, on horseback, he would have to ford a stream or a river. And if the water was high and rushing or the water was icy, he did this often at great physical peril to himself. And he had a humble sense of humor, often commenting wryly in his journals about maybe getting stuck somewhere and others having to come to his aid and give him shelter for the night or whatever other kinds of aid he might needed. But that hard-working dedication to serving the well-being of these faith communities who had called him to be their pastor has greatly worked its way into my sense of what it means to be a pastor. And often, when I know my own weariness and fatigue, I think of him, and I don't work myself to death, but I think, I can do what I yet must do this day. Yeah. Rest will come. I won't be lazy.
When you were describing a little bit of the side of like the importance of the administrative work, I couldn't help but think of like early church too, and the work, and how many of our epistles are just letters, right? It's handling disputes and settling things and setting it up, and to consider that into America becoming a country and getting formed and planting churches here, that was the same thing. And then I also think of the itinerant lifestyle that so many early Christians and those communities in general had to do, and that there's a beauty in that, because you're not, even though being away is hard, it really allowed, the spreading of so much knowledge and allowing things to grow. And I think there's a good thing about not being too planted in one place. Yeah. That there really is a beauty there that we sometimes lose. It makes it feel almost like our experience in ministry is so different. We often get a place and we stay in that place, and that the community is the community that we work in. So it's this idea that it's beyond that. It's beyond the four walls of a sanctuary that we do our work.
Well, the call that he answered in 1742 was, in fact, then the last call he ever accepted, but he understood it in large terms. And what you say about it's hard to be away, he was often very distant when his wife delivered their children. Yeah. And he would return home to meet his newest child. Later in life, there was a terrible occasion when his wife had been badly injured. They were both elderly, and she had turned over a kettle of boiling water on herself. And for a period, he remained at her side until she had healed well enough, recovered enough that he could leave her. The other thing that I wanted to mention, and I can close with this is perhaps the most significant accomplishment of his career in North America. He came with the understanding that the places he would be serving, they were very much under the care of Lutheran missionary agencies in Europe. And he joined the chorus of church leaders in colonial North America, constantly petitioning church authorities in Europe, send us pastors, we need more, we need more, we need more. And those who were sent were so few and far between and often proved unfit for the demands of North American life. And he resolved 6 years after he arrived, he reached the realization that what had to happen in North America is that the Lutherans had to find their way to raise up and ordain their own leaders. Yeah. And he did this in ecumenical partnership so that he himself would not be acting as a rogue. He called upon Episcopalian colleagues to lend good ecclesial warrant and credential, but then in 1748 made the bold step of ordaining men. They were all men at the time, but the first young men in North America to serve as pastors. And he had always envisioned that a seminary would be established, a Lutheran seminary in Philadelphia. That eventually occurred, but not till nearly a century after his death. But his vision in seeing what the context required and his insight, his boldness of intellect to say, this is what we need, it cannot wait, we're doing it. Mm-hmm. So I, as you may have gathered, if you've been listening or watching, I can go on for hours. I don't even need friends beside me. I can carry on an uninterrupted monologue. But we're going to stop. That's all we'll say about Henry Melchior Muhlenberg for this podcast episode. We are grateful if you've taken the time to watch or listen. We look forward to the 2 other episodes coming up in this series on luminaries of our Christian past. I'm Paul Baglios.
Sharon Baglios.
And I'm Megan Wyatt. Thanks for joining us.
This has been 2 Pews in a Pod, a podcast hosted by the pastor of Evangelical Lutheran Church in Frederick, Maryland. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.